Amelia Winters stood at the window staring blankly at the Chicago skyline. Her coffee sat untouched on the kitchen counter, its steam swirling lazily in the morning light. It was supposed to be an ordinary day, one like any other. She had a client meeting later that afternoon, followed by a dinner with a few old friends she hadn't seen in a while. Her life, though busy, had a sense of rhythm to it, a rhythm that was now shattered by the words echoing in her head. "Your father is dead." The call had come just an hour ago, and her mother's voice, broken and trembling, still rang in her ears. Amelia had dropped her phone in shock, her body refusing to move as she processed the news. It didn't make sense. How could he be gone? He was healthy, vibrant even, the kind of man who could fill a room with his presence. Her father, Raymond Winters, was only 58 years old, far too young to leave the world like this. A heart attack, her mother had said. But there was something in her voice that didn't sit right with Amelia. It wasn't just grief. It was something more, something unspoken. Her mother had been distant over the last few months, their conversations brief and stilted. And now, in the wake of her father's sudden death, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that there was something her mother wasn't telling her. She stared out the window, her thoughts racing. The city below seemed indifferent to her pain, the steady hum of life continuing without a care. But for Amelia, time had stopped. The only thing that mattered now was finding out what had happened to her father. She couldn't just accept that he was gone, not without answers. There were too many questions, too many loose ends. Amelia reached for her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed her mother's number again. It rang once, twice before going to voicemail. She left a message, her voice tight with emotion. "Mom, I'm coming home. I'll be there tonight." She hung up and stared at the screen for a moment, feeling the weight of her decision. Going back to Richmond wasn't something she had planned, not after the way she and her father had left things. Their last conversation had been an argument. About her career, about her choices. He hadn't approved of her leaving her law firm to start her own consulting business. He thought she was throwing away everything she had worked for. They had exchanged harsh words, words that now felt like a heavy burden on her heart. She regretted not reaching out sooner, not mending the rift between them. And now, it was too late. With a heavy sigh, Amelia turned away from the window and began packing her suitcase. She wasn't sure what she was walking into, but one thing was clear: she needed to find out what had really happened to her father. The plane ride to Richmond was a blur. Amelia spent the entire flight lost in thought, her mind cycling through memories of her father. She remembered the way he used to tuck her into bed when she was a little girl, telling her stories about faraway places and adventures. He had always been her hero, larger than life in every way. But as she grew older, their relationship had changed. He became more critical, more demanding, and their bond had strained under the weight of his expectations. She wondered if he had known how much she loved him, despite their differences. She hoped he had. When the plane finally touched down, Amelia felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. Richmond was a small town, the kind where everyone knew everyone's business. It was the kind of place she had been eager to leave behind after high school, craving the anonymity and opportunities that city life offered. But now, as she stepped off the plane and into the familiar, humid air of her hometown, she felt like a stranger. Her mother, Meredith Winters, was waiting for her at the airport, looking more frail than Amelia remembered. Her once vibrant auburn hair was streaked with gray, and her eyes were red from crying. She hugged Amelia tightly, but the embrace felt hollow, as if there was a wall between them. "I'm so glad you're here," Meredith whispered, her voice shaky. Amelia pulled back and looked at her mother, searching her face for answers. "What happened, Mom? How did Dad die?" Meredith's eyes flickered with something, guilt, fear, but she quickly looked away. "The doctor said it was a heart attack. It was sudden. There was nothing anyone could do." Amelia frowned. "But he was healthy. He didn't have any heart problems, did he?" Her mother hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. "No, but he was under a lot of stress lately. Work was difficult." That didn't sit right with Amelia. Her father had been running his real estate business for years. He thrived on pressure, loved the challenge of closing deals and negotiating contracts. Stress wouldn't have killed him. There had to be more to the story. Was he working on anything specific? Amelia asked, her voice careful. Meredith nodded, her eyes downcast. There was a land deal he was involved in. It was complicated. Amelia's stomach tightened. Complicated how? But before she could ask more, her mother changed the subject. Let's go home. The funeral is tomorrow, and there's a lot to do. Amelia reluctantly let the matter drop, but the seed of suspicion had already been planted. Something wasn't adding up, and she was determined to find out what. The Winters family home was a large colonial-style house on the outskirts of Richmond, nestled among tall oak trees and rolling hills. It was a beautiful, picturesque place, but as Amelia walked through the front door, it felt cold and empty without her father's presence. She spent the rest of the evening helping her mother with funeral arrangements, but her mind kept wandering back to the strange tension in her mother's voice. There was something she wasn't telling Amelia, something important. Later that night, after her mother had gone to bed, Amelia found herself standing in front of her father's study. The door was closed, and for a moment she hesitated. This room had always been his sanctuary, a place where he spent hours working or reading. It felt wrong to intrude, but she needed answers. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped inside. The study was exactly as she remembered it. Dark wood paneling, shelves lined with books, and her father's large mahogany desk in the center of the room. The air smelled faintly of his cologne, a scent that brought a lump to her throat. She walked over to the desk and sat down in his chair. Running her fingers over the smooth surface, there were papers scattered across the desk, contracts, financial statements, and a stack of letters. As she sifted through them, something caught her eye. One of the letters was handwritten, the ink bold and angry. It was from a man named William Graves, and the words sent a chill down her spine. You think you can get away with it, Raymond? You've made a grave mistake and you'll pay for it. You know what you've done. Amelia's heart raced as she read the letter again. Who was William Graves, and what did he mean by, "You'll pay for it"? This wasn't just a business dispute. This was a threat. She dug through the rest of the papers, searching for anything that could shed light on what her father had been involved in. As she worked, she became increasingly convinced that his death wasn't a heart attack at all. It was something much darker. The next morning, the funeral was held at the local church, a small, quaint building with stained glass windows and a peaceful cemetery out back. The pews were filled with people from the community, most of whom Amelia recognized from her childhood. But as she stood next to her mother and brother Daniel, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The service was somber, the priest's words a blur in her mind. Amelia couldn't focus on anything except the nagging suspicion that her father's death wasn't natural. She glanced around the room, her eyes landing on a man standing at the back, near the entrance. He was tall, with graying hair and sharp features. She didn't recognize him, but there was something about the way he was watching them that sent a shiver down her spine. After the service, as people gathered in the cemetery for the burial, Amelia saw the man again, standing a distance away, watching silently. She nudged Daniel and nodded toward him. Do you know who that is? Daniel frowned, following her gaze. No, I've never seen him before. Amelia's unease grew. Who was he, and why was he watching them? Amelia clutched the old yellowed piece of paper in her trembling hands. Her father's handwriting was unmistakable, but the words written on it chilled her to the core. If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident. Find the truth. Her heart raced as she reread the note. Why would her father, a man who always appeared so content and carefree, have written something so ominous? She sat back, her mind spinning. This note, hidden in the back of an old desk drawer, was not just a vague hint. It was a direct message to her. As she tried to piece together the fragments of her father's life, Amelia felt a gnawing sense of guilt. How had she missed the signs? Why hadn't she seen the unease in his eyes during the last few weeks they spent together? Lost in her thoughts, she failed to notice that her phone had been buzzing incessantly. It wasn't until she glanced at the screen that she saw the message from Lila, her best friend since childhood. Lila, Amelia, I've got something for you. Meet me at Dad's old workshop. Amelia's pulse quickened. The workshop. It had been abandoned for years, a relic of her father's past where he spent countless hours working on cars, a place that had held both fond memories and a hint of mystery. But Lila's cryptic message left her wondering, what had she found? The night was thick with fog when Amelia arrived at the workshop. The dim light from the moon barely illuminated the path ahead, casting long shadows from the trees that lined the property. The old building stood silent, its once vibrant walls now a canvas of peeling paint and rust. The air smelled of earth and rain, mixing with the faint, familiar scent of motor oil lingering in the air. Lila was already there, leaning against the hood of her car, arms crossed. "I found something, Amelia," she said, her voice low. "And I think you need to see it." Lila motioned toward the workshop's heavy, creaky door. She led Amelia inside, and together they descended into the dimly lit basement, where Lila handed her a file. Inside were several pages of financial records, but they weren't her father's. They belonged to William Graves, his business partner, and they detailed something darker than Amelia had ever imagined. "He was hiding this from your dad," Lila said softly. William Graves was embezzling from the business. Thousands of dollars gone, siphoned off in small amounts over years. Your dad must have found out. Amelia felt her breath catch. William Graves, the man she trusted all her life, the man who had stood beside her at her father's funeral, his face a mask of sorrow. But could he have killed her father to cover up his crime? The next morning, Amelia sat at the breakfast table, staring blankly at her coffee. The note, the financial records, and now William Graves. All the pieces were starting to fit together, but something still felt off. Why hadn't her father gone to the police when he found out? Why keep such a secret? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. She opened it to find Officer Clark standing on her porch. "We need to talk, Amelia," he said. Reluctantly, she invited him in, and they sat down in the living room. "There's been some new information," Clark began, pulling out his notepad. "We received an anonymous tip regarding your father's death. Something about a cover-up within his business. Does this ring any bells?" Amelia hesitated, but eventually nodded. She told him about the records Lila had found, and Clark listened intently, his expression unreadable. "I'll look into this," he said when she finished. "But be careful, Amelia. If William Graves is involved, this could get dangerous." After Clark left, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't telling her everything. His demeanor had been too casual, too practiced. Could he be in on this as well? The paranoia that had been growing in her since she found the note now felt like a suffocating weight on her chest. The days that followed were a blur of fear and confusion. Amelia couldn't trust anyone. Every conversation felt like a trap, every face masked with deceit. She spent hours locked in her room, poring over the files, trying to make sense of the connections. The embezzlement was only part of the puzzle. There was something else, something bigger. It wasn't until she went back to the workshop that she found the final clue. In an old toolbox, hidden beneath a layer of dust, she found a cassette tape. Scribbled on the label were the words, "For Amelia." With trembling hands, she played the tape on the old cassette player her father had kept in the workshop. His voice crackled through the speakers, weak but unmistakable. "Amelia, if you're hearing this, I'm probably gone. I didn't want to believe it, but there's no other explanation. William Graves, he's dangerous, but it's not just him. There's more at stake than money. I've uncovered something about the company, something that could ruin lives. They'll come for me, but I need you to be strong. Don't let them scare you. Find the truth." Amelia again continued to search through her father's study, her frustration growing with each passing hour. She pored over contracts, financial records, and letters, but none of them provided the clarity she needed. Her father's death had left a void, and the more she investigated, the more she felt that something dark and sinister was lurking behind the surface. The study was cold and dimly lit, the silence interrupted only by the occasional rustle of papers. Amelia's eyes fell on a dusty drawer in the corner of the room. She had ignored it before, thinking it was filled with old documents, but now it seemed like the last place she hadn't explored. With a determined breath, Amelia pulled open the drawer. Inside, she found a box marked, "Personal." Her heart quickened. She hadn't seen this box before. She opened it carefully, revealing a collection of old photographs, letters, and a small journal. She picked up the journal first, its leather cover cracked with age. The journal was filled with her father's handwriting, detailing his daily activities, his thoughts, and his frustrations. As she read through the entries, she discovered a troubling pattern. Her father had been increasingly worried about a particular individual, William Graves. The entries revealed that Graves was a partner in a real estate deal that had gone sour. The deal involved a large piece of land on the outskirts of Richmond, and it had become a contentious issue between Graves and her father. Raymond's entries were filled with tension. He described Graves as a man with a quick temper and a reputation for ruthless tactics. The last few entries mentioned that Graves had made threats and that Raymond had started to fear for his safety. The final entry was particularly alarming, detailing a meeting where Graves had confronted Raymond angrily, accusing him of deceit and betrayal. Amelia's hands shook as she closed the journal. It was clear now that Graves was more than just a disgruntled business partner. He was someone who had the motive and the means to cause harm. The puzzle pieces were starting to come together, but Amelia needed more information to understand the full scope of what had happened. She decided to visit the site of the controversial land deal. The land was located on the outskirts of Richmond, and Amelia hoped that seeing it in person might provide more clues. As she drove towards the property, her mind raced with questions. Why had Graves been so desperate to gain control of this land? What had her father uncovered that might have put him in danger? The land was vast and mostly undeveloped, with a few scattered buildings and overgrown vegetation. Amelia pulled up to the entrance, where a rusty gate stood slightly ajar. She parked her car and walked through the gate, her footsteps crunching on the gravel path. As she approached the main building, she noticed a man working on the property, a rugged, middle-aged man with a scruffy beard and a worn-out hat. He was repairing a broken fence and glanced up as Amelia approached. "Excuse me," Amelia said, trying to sound as polite as possible. "I'm Amelia Winters. I'm here to look into the property my father was involved with. I was hoping you could tell me more about it." The man wiped his hands on a rag and studied her for a moment. "I'm Tom Barker. I used to work for Raymond Winters. What do you want to know?" Amelia's heart raced. "Did you know anything about the issues he was having with William Graves?" Tom's face hardened. "Graves is trouble. Always has been. Raymond was trying to protect this land from being exploited. Graves wanted to turn it into something that would ruin the community. Raymond was a good man, but he made enemies with that deal." Amelia's eyes widened. "Enemies?" Tom nodded. "Graves didn't like being challenged. He's got connections, people who can get things done. Things that aren't exactly legal. Raymond was the only one standing in his way, and Graves wasn't the type to back down easily." Amelia felt a chill run down her spine. This was the breakthrough she needed. Graves had powerful connections and a reason to eliminate her father, but she still didn't understand Officer James Clark's role in all this. She drove back to Richmond, her mind racing with thoughts of Graves and his ruthless tactics. As she approached her mother's house, she saw Officer James Clark's car parked outside. Clark was the local police officer who had been assigned to the case of her father's death. She had been wary of him from the beginning, sensing an odd distance in his demeanor. Determined to find answers, Amelia walked into the house and found Clark sitting in the living room with her mother. The room was filled with a tense atmosphere, and Clark looked up as Amelia entered. "Amelia," Clark said, standing up, "I was just going over some details with your mother." Amelia's gaze was steely. "Officer Clark, can I speak to you privately?" Clark's eyes flickered with surprise, but he nodded. They moved to a quiet corner of the house. "What's going on?" Amelia asked, her voice low. "I've been looking into my father's death, and I believe there's more to it than a heart attack." Clark's expression hardened. "Amelia, your father's death was ruled as a heart attack. There's no evidence to suggest otherwise." Amelia leaned in closer. "I found threats from William Graves in my father's study. Graves had a motive, and I think he's involved in my father's death. What's your stake in this?" Clark's face grew pale, and he hesitated. "I was asked to investigate the case, but there are things I can't disclose. Sometimes, law enforcement has to tread carefully in cases like this." Amelia's eyes narrowed. "Are you involved in this?" Did you know about the threats? Clark looked conflicted. I knew about the threats, but I was under pressure to keep the investigation low-key. Graves is influential and there were directives to avoid stirring up too much trouble. I'm sorry, Amelia. I was trying to protect you and your family from any further distress. Amelia's heart sank. Clark's involvement in the case was more complex than she had realized. His attempt to shield her family from the truth only made things worse. But now, she had to focus on proving Graves's guilt and finding justice for her father. Amelia decided to confront Graves directly. She had gathered enough evidence to present a case, and she needed to see if the man himself would slip up. She arranged a meeting with him under the pretense of discussing the land deal. Graves met her in a luxurious office, his demeanor cold and calculating. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his graying hair neatly combed back. Amelia could see the arrogance in his eyes as he greeted her. "Miss Winters," Graves said smoothly. "What can I do for you?" Amelia took a deep breath. "I've been looking into my father's death. I found letters and documents suggesting that you had a motive to harm him. What really happened?" Graves's expression flickered for a moment, and then he smiled. "You're treading on dangerous ground, Amelia. Your father was a significant obstacle, but he brought that upon himself. He was meddling where he shouldn't have." Amelia pressed on. "Did you have him killed? Did you threaten him?" Graves's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "You're delving into matters that are far beyond your understanding. I suggest you let this go before you find yourself in over your head." Amelia left the meeting with a heavy heart, knowing that Graves was hiding something. She reported her findings to Officer Clark, who promised to escalate the case despite the constraints he had been under. With Clark's renewed support, the investigation gained momentum. Evidence emerged linking Graves to shady dealings and threats against Raymond. Amelia worked tirelessly to piece together the evidence and build a case against Graves. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Graves had used his connections to orchestrate her father's murder. He had hired someone to make it look like a heart attack, ensuring that the real cause of death remained obscured. Officer Clark, though initially reluctant, became an ally in the quest for justice, fighting against the pressure and influence exerted by Graves. In the end, the case against Graves was solid. He was arrested and charged with Raymond Winters' murder, among other crimes. The trial was long and grueling, but Amelia and her family found solace in the truth finally coming to light. As Amelia stood at her father's grave one last time, she felt a sense of closure. The journey had been painful, filled with doubt and sorrow, but she had uncovered the truth and ensured that justice was served.